is going on, everybody? It is the Vanishing Mediators. We are back at it again. We are returning after a long break with another banger. Eminem, Marshall Mathers, no, Metaphor and Metonymy, 1 and 2 in Seminar 3 of Jacques Lacan. I'm with Nick Castellucci, Free Beer Tomorrow, and Maximilian Costa, our third member, aka Maximillionaire.
Love that.
Yep. Coming up with some portmanteaus, as Freud would love. So, Max, you're leading us off with a great presentation, as
Yes.
always.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, you have to make me a co-host again.
All
I can
right.
edit this out. Okay.
No, keep it in. This is me performing the paternal function.
Yes.
Right here, the metaphor is a go. You are a
Okay.
co-host now. Can you
Perfect.
share your screen along
Yes.
with
As Andrew said, I'm going to present from Seminar 3, Chapter 17, Metaphor and Metonymy 1. And that, of course, is a super crucial chapter. Why? Because Lacan is constantly reminding us in this seminar and everywhere, basically, that we should always focus on the signifier, not on the signified, but on the signifying apparatus, on the structure of the signifier. And what is metaphor and metonymy? It is an operation of this structure. Now, Lacan derives these two terms, of course, from Roman Jakobson, a Russian linguist who actually, at the time of this seminar, was teaching at Harvard University because he had to flee the Czech Republic in 1939 because the Nazis were invading there. And the chapter or the text that Lacan is referring to is the second part of a book by Jakobson called Fundamentals of Language, which actually was published in the year when this seminar was taking place, so 1956. And the second part of this book is titled Two Aspects of Language and Two Types of Aphasic Disturbances. And of course, the title there already gives a hint what this second part of the book is about. It is about two axes that are necessary for the proper functioning of language. And if one of them is not functioning properly, then you have one of the two types of aphasia, of course. Now, the fundamental axiom that Jakobson starts with, together with his co-author, because that's not a text just by him, is that a linguistic unit is always connected to other linguistic units. So a phoneme, a word, a sentence, and so on. But there are two ways that this linguistic unit can be connected with others. If you give to someone the impulse or the word hat and ask them to respond, they can respond in two ways. And these two ways exemplify the two axes of language. For example, that's the exact example that Jakobson is giving. You can respond by saying burned out. So the hut is burned out. Right? That would be the full sentence. The other way, one of the examples, you could respond is by saying hovel. Now, these two responses represent the two different axes of language. What characterizes these axes? The first one, the horizontal axis, is the axis of combination. The axis of combination is where one linguistic unit gives context to another one, right? So what is burned out? Hat is burned out. There's the context. That's where predication actually happens, right? That's the axis of alignment. So you align one linguistic unit with another one. You form a chain, right? And very important for Jakobson, and Chiesa actually says that this is different for Lacan. This axis of combination is always in presentia, right? It's always there. When you say, when you hear the articulation of a sentence, for example, of an utterance, what is there is the axis of combination, physically, if you want to say it like that. The other axis is the axis of selection. That's the vertical axis, right? On this axis, and that's important, that's different from the other one, it's in absentia. So it's not really there physically, right? If you want to say it like that, in the articulation, but it's implied by the articulation, by the linguistic unit of hat. What is implied? All the other words that could have been chosen, that could have been selected in its place. So all the synonyms or the antonyms. And Jacobson says selection implies substitution. So Havel could substitute hat. So these are the two axes. And now what do they have to do with metaphor and metonymy? These two axes, first of all, none of them is metaphor and none of them is metonymy. Rather, Jacobson says, they find the most condensed expression in metaphor and metonymy, right? Metaphor is aligned to the similarity disorder. That's the kind of aphasia you have when the vertical axis doesn't function properly. And metonymy to the contiguity disorder. That's when the other axis doesn't function, right? And he says, the development of a discourse may take place along two different semantic lines. One topic may lead to another either through their similarity or through their contiguity. The metaphoric way would be the most appropriate term for the first case, and the metonymic way for the second, since they find their most condensed expression, right? So it's not exactly the same. He's just saying it's kind of the best example of these axes, or they find their most condensed expression in that, right? So I want to look more detailed at what exactly would be metaphor and what exactly would be metonymy for Jacobson, and then we go to Lacan, right? So again, the amazing example, hat. You could respond to it on the axis of selection. You could just say hat as a response. It's a tautology, would be on the axis of selection. Cabin, a synonym. That's all directly quoted basically from Jacobson, right? Now what I'm saying. Could also say palace, that's an antonym, right? But it's still on the axis of selection, also not a metaphor. But then that would be a metaphor, Jacobson says. Why would that be a metaphor? Well, I can gather from the qualifiers that Jacobson says about this word. Why is it a metaphor? Because it has a positional similarity. So it's put at the place, or can be put at the place of hat in a sentence. The den is burnt out, right? Or whatever. And it has a semantic similarity. So it's somewhat similar to hat. It's not exactly the same, but somewhat similar. These two things have to be there so you can say it's a metaphor. I could gather from the Jacobson text, right? Now, what about metonymy? If you say burned out, the hut is burned out, that's giving context. That's a classic thing that happens on the axis of combination. And it has positional contiguity. So the hut is burned out. It just follows hut in the axis of combination, right? In the sentence that is physically present. So it has a positional contiguity. Not metonymy yet. The hut is a little house, positional contiguity, but interestingly, that's not purely combination. There's a little bit of selection in there because little house has a semantic similarity. It's somewhat similar to hut, but it follows it, so it's not a metaphor. And now the metonymy is thatch. That would be a metonymy. Everything else before is not a metonymy. Why is it a metonymy? Because it is characterized by semantic contiguity. What is semantic contiguity? That means if you imagine these taxonomies of meaning, thatch is a part of hut. So there has been a displacement, or there's a contiguity between thatch and hut in the taxonomies of these words, right? And it has to have a positional similarity. So you put thatch at the place of hut. And then you have a metonymy, basically. That's a super complicated and technical way to explain what metonymy is in the terms of Jacobson, right? Now, what does Lacan say about metaphor and metonymy? Finally, he does something really strange with metaphor and metonymy, and I think what this strange thing is exemplified really good in this quote. He's saying, while a latter part of analytic investigation, one concerning identification and symbolism, is on the side of metaphor, let's not neglect the other side, that of articulation and contiguity, with what is here sketched out, that is initial and structuring in the notion of causality. The rhetoric form that is the opposite of metaphor has a name, it's called metonymy. So what is strange, I think, is, so of course we will look at metaphor also, because he identifies it with identification, but the strange thing, I think, is that he identifies metonymy with articulation and contiguity. So whereas metonymy is a really specific combination of different, so there are different things that have to be there, different kinds of contiguity and similarity that have to be there for it to be a metonymy in Jacobson. For Lacan, seemingly all articulation, all contiguity fall under metonymy, right? And I think that may be a little bit more clearer in this example, where he's going through all the different examples that also Jacobson is giving, right? He's saying, for example, metaphor, borrow would be a metaphor. He's saying fetch, of course, is also a metonymy. But then he has these other things up there where he is talking about the register of contiguity, which just before he also identified with metonymy. So my claim is, without really addressing it, he's identifying all contiguity with metonymy, not just this example of thatch, because dirtiness or poverty, that's a semantic contiguity. Like from hovel or from cabin, there could follow, there's a relation in these taxonomies to dirtiness or poverty. That's not a metonymy in the classical sense, but he's still calling it a metonymy because it's a semantic contiguity. So yeah, that would be my claim. All kinds of contiguity for Lacan are metonymy. And from this contiguity, of course, follows a logic of placements, right? Of positions. That's also what Jacobson is talking about, kind of. Like there's this logic of positions in an articulated sentence, right? That also relates to metonymy, I think, or falls under metonymy for Lacan. Then metaphor has the specific qualification, or the definition of metaphor is where the definition of metonymy is all kinds of contiguity and the logic of places that follows from that in articulations, in utterances. Metaphor is defined by undoing these pre-established contiguities in the taxonomies, right? That are of metonymy. That's how I understand what he's saying in that chapter. And how does he explain that? Of course, with the sentence before the metaphor happens. Boaz was neither miserly nor hateful, right? There's a logic of positions there, right? There are certain words are in certain places. That's still metonymy. But then we have a substitution. Sheaf goes to the position of our subject, Boaz, and it takes his place in that pre-established logic of places. Right? What happens thereby? This lexical connection, right, between Boaz and his qualifiers of being miserly, of course, is being undone, whereby by identification with sheaf, which can happen because there's a pre-established logic of places, by metonymy, and by putting sheaf at the place of boars that has been established by the logic of metonymy, there's an identification between the two. But the important thing is, this identification is none that follows from any kind of semantic similarity or semantic contiguity. Sheaf isn't something that has a similar meaning like boars, and it isn't really related to boars in any kind of semantic contiguity. So in these connections of these taxonomies of meaning. For example, I think an example of where the semantic contiguity would be if you say his heart was neither miserly nor hateful, right? His heart it's literally a part of his body, right? That would be not a metaphor for Lacan. For Lacan, it's only a metaphor if there is no semantic contiguity, but you still put it at his place, at the place of the subject. And I think that's what he's saying here. This phase of symbolism that is expressed in metaphor presupposes similarity, which is exhibited uniquely by position. So there has to be a pre-established logic of positions, and this position makes the similarity. The similarity doesn't pre-exist. There's no similarity between Boaz and his sheaf, but because of this positionality, it exists, right? It's by virtue of being the subject of miserly and spiteful that the sheaf can be identified with Boaz in his lack of avarice and so on. It's by virtue of the similarity of position that the sheaf is literally identical to the subject. This dimension of similarity is surely the most striking thing about the significant use of language and so on, right? Because the important thing is there's no connections between the two. But how does this relate to our patient, Schreber, right? Because that's how I started. I said, Lacan is always telling us we should focus on the signifiers because they determine what is most crucial in the Freudian discovery. Of course, we have discussed that many times. Schreber always hears unfinished sentences. Something is missing in these sentences. And he is being forced by these voices to fill these sentences. What Lacan is aiming at, I think, is saying that these kernel words that are missing, or the meaning that is missing, is metaphor. And Schreber is being called to fill, of course, this empty place. He is placed in the overhang, in what remains. That's interesting. I really think that sentence is super interesting. He is placed at that place. What is missing? The rays tell him. The principal thought is missing. We rays lack thought. Right? They lack a real meaning because they don't have metaphor. And he is being asked to fill that place. Yeah, and interestingly, this forcing him to fill this place starts out by what later will become Gaul, of course, in the beginning being Flexic, wanting to enter his body to force him into this position, basically. That's what Lacan is gesturing towards. Flexic is entering his body, of course. It's the signifying system that wants him to enter it, right? To have a symbolic identification, which he isn't capable of having. Why am I saying that? Because Lacan is stressing that he, Schreber, is placed in the overhang, in the place of the missing metaphor, in the place of the missing principal thought. And we have something similar in this sentence. Where is sheaf placed? Of course, at the place of the subject. So I think there is some close connection, as I was also saying to you, Nick, between this metaphor and the subject. So this cutting into the pre-established contiguities has something to do with the subject. And of course, this metaphor is kind of because it is different from all the pre-existing differences. It's the difference of difference. And I'm only gesturing towards things because that's also what Lacan is doing here. Also pointing out that this metaphor has something to do with the myth of the murdered father, right? Something to do with something spiritual, something that's beyond the physical, but definitely having to do something with Freud's myth of the primordial father. But he isn't going further than that. He's just gesturing towards it. He's leaving it a mystery, right? Because he's saying what characterizes Freud's thought is that there's always a sense of mystery. And that central mystery is, how did language enter the human reality, right? And he's saying that language entering human reality has to do with truth entering human reality. And that has to do with the death of the primordial father. That has to do with metaphor entering the pre-established contiguities of language and the symbolic identification. Yeah.
Very nice indeed. Beautifully presented, beautifully explicated. Um, I love what you mapped out there with Boaz, Booze, uh, the man of the sheaf. My only question is, and
Yeah.
I'm not entirely certain that my contention is correct here, but I was thinking there is a certain semantic contiguity between sheaf and Boaz, because some of the examples that I think it's both Lacan and Jakobson use, which they get from Tolstoy, are of her bare shoulders standing for Anna Karenina.
Mhm.
I don't think it's that much of a leap to think that an accessory or an object associated with a character would also be metonymic of that character. And Lacan says something kind of cryptic in the next chapter about the sheaf being metonymic of his royal penis.
Yeah.
Right. I was just thinking the same thing,
And
right? I
I'm
was thinking
thinking,
about
like,
that too.
without even bringing his penis into the discussion, it's kind of like, what is he actually saying? Jokes aside, that the sheaf is, in some sense, metonymic of Boaz, but the effect of the metaphor is there's a kind of uh, triangle here of his absence from the statement, this the sheaf that fills in for his absence, and then these attributes of the sheaf, which of course better applied directly to him. um I mean, and again, this is just a sort of hair splitting point, but I think that there might be some semantic
No,
contiguity.
I totally
Well,
agree. I
I
totally
that
agree. And
makes
that's the question I had too. I just try to make sense of
but
Yeah.
the
but
rest.
what makes me think it's like this is what he's trying to do with his introduction of the signifier of presence and absence, because what does the signifier have but absence of a signifier, right? So again, when we're talking about the signifier, we can't help but also talk about the subject and the axiom or his perfect definition, as he'll say in Seminar 16. It's the signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. So when the subject is being represented towards the other or the other signifier, it must take the form of this metaphor or a substitute, whether it's metaphor and metonymy, if I'm understanding you guys correctly. And I think like um it makes me think of what I was thinking of earlier was, and I read it, was Freud's essay on the loss of reality in neurosis psychosis. And this is what Lacan was talking about in the beginning. He talks about it in one chapter, but then he doesn't talk about it again, as if like he wants us to think that like we should be keeping it in our minds. And so in a sense, both subjects, the neurotic and the psychotic, um, in a sense, lose reality because of the traumatic event. And we could see that as the sort of traumatic kernel, which is the instantiation of the paternal metaphor, right? The name of the father. This is the sort of this the trauma that introduces us as subjects. It's the cause of the subject. It is that unary trait, that Unbegriff, right? And for Freud, though, he makes this distinction that there is a sort of substitute reality for the neurotic, insofar as they also try to repress the knowledge of such traumatic event. He talks about a patient in which, or not a patient, it's like maybe a patient or a case study of a woman who had onset hysteria after her sister died, and she had very much like romantic feelings for her brother-in-law,
Yeah,
and
I remember that. Yeah,
yeah, and then represses the memory of her saying or thinking in her head, uh, now that she's dead, he can marry anyone and possibly me.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
so that becomes a sort of repressed moment and returns in a different form. Now, keep up with me. Like what he'll say is that the psychotic could kind of do the same thing, but in a sense, disavow it. He uses the term disavow early in his career of understanding psychosis, but it doesn't mean the same thing as like fetishistic disavow. But I think it kind of ties into the thing of like, even though there's flaws to your delusion, you still love your delusion like yourself, right? It still becomes a part of like your substitute reality, and it kind of adds on, but in a sort of metonymic way without pure metaphor. But what I'm getting at is like what we see is like there is a substitution of absence, and the absence is a trauma. But
Well,
in erotic, it takes this sort of metaphor and metonymic because without, if I'm understanding you guys correctly, we have to have metaphor first before we have metonymy for the neurotic subject, right?
I think with
No,
this
other way around.
example though,
So, yeah.
what's interesting about this example though is that you would think he would take his interpretation of it in the direction of course a sheaf isn't miserly or spiteful. If you look at the taxonomy of all of the different qualities, which would go on forever associated with any one object, in this case a sheaf, miserly and spiteful would never figure. That line alone in isolation makes no sense. But
Right.
oh, it definitely goes into what you're saying because it's like what he points out is that the sheaf, which I'm taking to be metonymic of Boaz and stands in for him there, gives an extra kind of punch to
Mhm.
the effect of calling Boaz miserly or not miserly and spiteful,
Yeah.
because he is invoked as this absence, right? So yeah, there's a substitutive reality contained in that statement, which gives metaphor
Yeah.
its full
Just,
effect.
Yeah.
yeah, I just want
So,
to
and so to
respond
correct
to that
myself,
before
it's
you
not the
go.
metaphor that comes first. It's metonymy, right? But in a sense, it's like the metonymy could have this sort of phonemic type thing of the
Well,
letter, the
I'm
letter.
not sure though because
It's
Paris
both.
said to
It's
me that
both.
Miller says that metonymy is a kind of a form of metaphor. So I don't know. I'm not exactly clear on this. That's what
Right.
he said, but I
And
don't know.
so not even talking about like Jacobson, but like, what metaphor are we talking about? But the metaphor of Oedip or of the paternal function, which is a part of Oedipus.
Right,
So
right.
when we talk about this primordial emergence of the signifier, it's like this dialectic of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the metonymy or the metaphor? Well, it's both, but the way that it probably functions, right?
I think he puts really strong emphasis on the fact that the the condition that the condition of possibility, right, for metaphor is metonymy. That's what he's saying constantly.
Yeah.
So I would say like for Schreber also like he knows language. Language is there. Like these taxonomies, these connections are totally there for him, but they are not. There's no identification, right? There's no metaphor that has happened in that sense. No paternal metaphor that has put him into the position of being capable of a symbolic identification. That's why I would think. So yes, you're kind of correct. Like, but metonymy is still there, but in a different register.
But you know what's also
Or
interesting to
metaphor.
me is the way that Schreber cannot pick out, pluck one detail that would be metonymic of him in this way that the different examples cited by Lacan in the next chapter, my favorite, of course, my big girl full of bottom and muscles. It's like we'll get to that a little bit later. It'll make more sense. But as he says, it's one detail which acts as a guide through, let's say, this maze of desire, which he likens to the sorts of mazes that we make mice travel through to sort of track their instincts. But it seems like whenever whenever Schreber focuses in on one detail, which would be in some sense metonymic of his desire, it fans out into a multitude of other details,
Yes.
which never get quilted. So he can never fully represent himself for the other without these details ultimately sort of taking the
Yeah.
reins of
Yeah,
desire
absolutely. And
deliberation.
Lacan is saying that you can't compare him exactly to an aphasic, right? That's not possible. He doesn't have aphasia, but still there is a similarity, right? And that similarity is pretty clear with these weird words like nerve contact, right?
Yeah.
The aphasic that has the similarity disorder, he's incapable of metalinguistic statements. He cannot say the hut is a little house. He cannot define things. Like an example that Jakobson is giving is the compass. Like someone shows him a compass, right? And asks him, what is that? Incapable of doing that. Or even repeating his own sentences or defining words. He cannot say a bachelor is an unmarried man. That's an example that Jakobson gives. So in these examples, metaphor doesn't function for them, that the vertical axis doesn't function. So it's similar with nerve contact. Like he can never really define it, but he can just metonomically go on about it endlessly. But
Yeah,
nonetheless, I just wanted to answer your question, Nick. And I think that goes back to the example is really bad because Lacan himself addresses it in Metaphor and Metonymy too. He's saying, yeah, some people told me actually the sheaf is there is semantic contiguity, right? That is
right.
metonymy. Um, and he says they might be correct, okay? But then he gives these other examples, I think, to make it more clearer because he realized his own example is bad. These examples of the surrealist theater piece where they just randomly replaced words in a
Right.
sentence, or like love is like a pebble laughing in the sun. There is, it's really, it's there is no direct semantic contiguity between a pebble and love. But just because we put it into that position of this sentence, that connection is made, right? I think that's what he's trying to say, that there
Yeah,
shouldn't be a semantic, there is no semantic contiguity in metaphor. I
I
just
was
think the
thinking,
example
yeah,
is
there's
bad.
sort of this.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And Paris agrees that the examples are misleading in this one. But I think, like, with the love is a pebble laughing in the sunshine, and then the other two quotes from that play where it's like the pebbles, I think, are stand-ins for time passed between these two people
Yeah.
seeing each other. The framework instantly jumps out at you, and you are able to more or less, I'm sure there'd be some divergences of opinion here, understand what's being said between these two characters because of that, what Jakobson calls like nominative capacity that we have as non-aphasics, um, to fill in those gaps, because it's like the framework, and it is a framework ultimately provided by the kind of metonymic contiguity, but that framework is always there. And this is sort of what I think unites his understanding of the diachronic with the synchronic. And I think that's what he's really trying to emphasize here, is that they're one and the same.
Yeah.
The synchronic is not static, but the diachronic is not just a succession of phonemes or units of time either. So they have to be thought together. The entire structure of language as a whole is constantly invoked through metaphor.
Yeah. And I think that's also where the night day example and that what you were saying, Andrew, about absence and presence comes in, because that vertical axis of selection, that's basically you put a word there and that implies all the other words that are not there, right? That's with the night and day. But
Yeah, and
I
it's
mean,
funny. This is where like even like I wouldn't say Derrida understood metaphor and metonymy or whether or not he engaged with Jacobson, but this is even where it's like, there is no metaphor or language without metaphor. I mean, even discourse has a metaphor to it because like when you say like, well, what is truth? Truth should be clear, truth should be transparent, or truth is what enlightens us. Like that's right there. Like even in the discourse of philosophy, we see how metaphor, operates on the level of I guess truth and how I guess we could even see it with how the subject creates that in causing discourse because when we get it like to like Lacan's mathemes, it's the subject, even though is represented by the signifier, can't be thought of without the signifier for the discourse. Um,
and it makes me think also though of humor and jokes and why they are important for the unconscious, because it's exactly like you were saying there, Max, where it's sort of like you're playing with this substitutive capacity and sometimes just the framework itself, and sometimes not saying a certain word,
yeah,
evokes that word in someone's mind. And that's what a lot of humor plays on, is subverting expectations in that way. But then if someone doesn't get a certain kind of joke, if we say it flies over their head, another sort of metaphor there, it's like it's because somehow there's some pocket of this signifying apparatus, let's say, that they aren't in, and it's like I think that's why jokes are so important for Freud.
yeah, totally, totally. That they
then
totally are based on these taxonomies that we all have to share, so it works. Yeah.
Well, that's funny that you brought it up because one of the questions I had in mind is now, since I mean both of you all have been really adamant about metaphor and metonymy and in fleshing the two out. Nick had some questions for me a while back that we were confused about, but I think he talks about it in the second chapter on how metaphor and metonymy tie into Freud's dream theory with condensation and displacement.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
how can we see
Smooth
those,
transition.
yeah, play out? I'm gonna be the subject as hysteric because he does mention that, and this is the sort of criticism that Laplanche gives Lacan and Jacobson, but mainly Lacan's use of Jacobson, not because he thinks it's the right one, but because he thinks that we shouldn't use metaphor and metonymy as psychoanalysts because he thinks that it conceals the fact that there is something distinct about displacement from condensation that metaphor and metonymy conceals. But I would beg to differ based upon
Well,
just
it
seeing.
I think it's like the way Paris put it to me is like we can't look at metaphor and metonymy as two objects of language.
Right.
Rather, they should be seen as two analytics of language. So they really do have to be thought together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting that both Jacobson and Lacan agree that metaphor, at least when it comes to literary studies, is always overemphasized to the detriment of metonymy, which is just as powerful and just as effective of a device as metaphor. It's just underappreciated. When it comes to dreams, it's like he says it's like, oh, okay, fine. You Jungians, he's taking Jung to task a little bit. Y'all want to look for symbolism in everything we're dreaming about. And yes, symbols there are. However, what the analyst should be keeping track of just as diligently is metonymy, both metonymy in the sense of like what you were talking about, Max, like with semantic contiguity, but also kind of like phonematic contiguity. And you can analyze a dream in that key of, let's break down the signifiers rebus style, and then also pick out like what phonemes in one word might lead to the inception of a symbol that emerges following it, and then you pick out the structure. And sometimes I don't know if this has to do with metonymy, but I'm thinking about when I've undergone analysis and have, put the spyglass, is that's one of the similarity disorder examples, I think, or maybe it's contiguity disorder examples that
Yeah.
Jacobson uses. But when I've like put the microscope to a dream, um, one of the features of my description that my analyst focuses on usually has to do with the temporal or directionality, up, down, side by side, or anything having to do with temporality. I can't think of so many examples of that, but that might take us afield of what we're talking about right now. But I think there's something about like the succession of images broken down into signifiers that we're looking for, and that's metonymic, and that has something to do with temporality too, especially for Schraber.
Yeah, but could you repeat, Andrew, what you were saying, what Laplanche was saying exactly? Because displacement, I think displacement is obviously has to do with things like semantic contiguity, right? Or what you
Right,
were
right.
saying.
Yeah. I mean, he
Make,
does talk about contiguity on the level of displacement, but he says that that's something way different than the process of metaphor and metonymy. I don't have the text off the top of my head. I remember posting it in the group chat a while back, but I think for the most part, everything that Lacan is saying about it in terms of condensation, displacement are pretty spot on. I think again, it's like there are all these sort of like uh detractions against Lacan and the use of such and such term that they really misread what he's trying to do, or like trying to get a stab at Lacan. But it's like Lacan already got about like went about this process before he even did it. So it's like Lacan was right.
but I mean, I understand what they are saying because
Yeah.
it's very confusing when he uses these terms and when he uses these exact examples that Jakobson is using, but he's aiming into a different direction, right? He's
Yeah.
going into a different direction. So I
And I
understand.
guess like bringing it into to the Freud aspect of displacement and condensations, because he talks about in the interpretation of dreams like something that Anna Freud was saying, because she sleepwalks, and it's this saying in her sleep as she's walking that Freud notices, and she screams like big strawberries, raspberries, cakes,
Right.
you know.
I love that. Yeah, but I think the point he's making there is that Anna Freud isn't capable yet of metaphor, okay?
Right.
So this metonymic chain, it begins with her name. That's what
Yeah.
he's saying. And there again, I think is this connection between metaphor and the subject and symbolic identification. Because I guess he wants to say if she would be capable of metaphor, she would be saying that she is a strawberry, right?
Yeah.
She would be putting herself at the place of the strawberry or something like that, right? Uh, but yeah, I think that's the part where he talks about children and how they don't have metaphor yet, right?
And they hate Picasso.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
apparently they
not
don't.
true at all. Okay, kids love Picasso.
Certain stages of Picasso's paintings, he says,
Yeah.
they find repugnant, and they detest surrealist poetry because in France, obviously, children are read surrealist poetry along with their
Yeah.
glass of carafe of red wine before bed. So, um,
Do you
But
want to
yeah, not
present,
up to
Nick?
metaphor, only metonymy.
What do you think, Nick? Do you want to present and then we,
Yeah.
yeah, more detailed about
I mean,
MM2?
yeah, let's see. I mean, I just wrote today some commentaries on some key passages. Might be a little all over the place, a little staccato, a little metonymic, but I could just read the passages and read my
Yes.
commentary, and then we can all jump off from there. All right, so I wasn't able to write as much as I would have liked because there's a lot going on in this chapter. But I did want to highlight where he talks about how what he's doing is not, as he puts it, quote, a rehash of the relation upon which the notion of expression rests, where the thing, that which one refers to, is expressed by a word regarded as a label. My discourse is intended precisely to destroy this idea. And I think this is an example of Lacan early on trying to separate himself and his entire teaching from nominalism. And his view of language is not nominalistic, although it's often been mistaken as a nominalistic view of language, because he's not talking about words as labels. Um, and the problem with nominalism, in a sense, I thought, is that it sort of reifies thinking by denying the signifier an essential autonomy. And that for Lacan, the proliferation of the signifying function and signifiers results in these ramifications of meaning. And that's one of the things he really wants to stress in this chapter. Meaning has a material effectivity, and that the signifier is in a sense, the cause of the being of a world for the subject. This is the Umwelt, which is not naturally prefashioned for the subject. A little bit later on, he says, one can see the subject protest against a reading of an observation that conveys a given precise historical detail concerning a date, an hour, a form of behavior. I should break in here and say that he's talking about aphasia. And I think he's still talking about similarity disorder at this point, which is, to put it simply, just the kind of aphasia that affects an individual who's unable to substitute one signifier for another in the way Max outlined earlier. Back to Lacan, this is when the subject trots out his discourse, however disturbed and jargonophasic in its character. Should he make a mistake, it's still in relation to a definite historical detail he possessed just 5 minutes earlier that he begins to enter the dialogue. Here one can grasp the presence and intensity of the intentionality at the heart of the deployment of discourse, which never manages to catch up with it again. So basically, he's talking about how the struggle of the aphasic in this case is basically that they're unable to pick up the thread of discourse where it left off. Sometimes they're responding to an imaginary, not in the psychotic sense, but like something that was said to them that wasn't actually said to them, say kind of like almost like an internal monologue, and they aren't able to, in a sense, keep pace with the flow of discourse because the stock of terms that belongs to their language isn't readily available to them. Jacobson says, in this type of language disturbance, sentences are conceived as elliptical sequels to be supplied from antecedent sentences, uttered, if not imagined, by the aphasic himself, or received by him from the other partner of the colloquy, actual, if not imaginary. So that's him basically explaining what I endeavored to say there. What I got from this is that this sort of intentionality, and this is what would distinguish the aphasic from the psychotic in my mind, occurs as an effect of the circuit between addresser and addressee. As two, let's say, little others in a shared universe. That's something that eludes, that's a dynamic that eludes Schreber. This aphasic is not a psychotic because he can enter into a discourse which presupposes a circuit of this kind against the background of S2, treasure trove of signifiers. He doesn't lack this delimiting border of the name of the Father, but does lack the nominative capacity to bring the subject of a statement into play. So he wants very badly to make substitutions. And I think he's able to figure this out. Like there are these sort of ready-made like statements that do kind of from time to time allow him to nominate the subject of a statement, but for the psychotic it's very different because who he's addressing and who addresses him, it's much more ambiguous, because it's this circuit that's absent. A little bit later on, he says here it's essentially the articulation. This is Lacan, not Jacobson. The syntax of language, which progressively along the scale of cases and in the evolution of certain subjects, deteriorates to the point of making them incapable of articulating in a compound sentence what they are nevertheless able to name correctly. They retain the nominative capacity, but lose the propositional capacity. They're unable to construct propositions. So now we're talking about contiguity disorder. And with contiguity disorder, the syntactical combinations of words that allow meaning to be conveyed is not possible for someone with this condition. So instead, what they say, their speech amounts to, as this linguist Hewlings Jackson says, a word heap. And Hewlings Jackson also says, and Jacobson quotes him, it is not enough to say that speech consists of words. It consists of words referring to one another in a particular manner, and without a proper interrelation of its parts, a verbal utterance would be a mere succession of names embodying no proposition. The loss of speech is the loss of power to propositionize. Speechlessness does not mean entire wordlessness. I like this quote because of how he distinguishes speechlessness from wordlessness, and that brings us nearer to a sense of speech which might even please Lacan. Lacan says the first is the dissolution of the link between intentional meaning and the apparatus of signifiers. By first, he's talking about similarity disorder. The latter is on the whole retained by the subject who nevertheless fails to master it in relation to his intention. The second is the dissolution of the link internal to the signifier. Here, the fact is emphasized that there is a sort of regressive decomposition, which is sufficiently well explained by the Jacksonian theory, according to which functions decompose in the inverse order of their acquisition, not in development. Language isn't reducible to the ideally primary language of the infant, but through a veritable turning, and uses this word turning from English. I found that a little bit confusing, but basically he's talking about these internal properties of the signifier, these two links, and as usual, it's somewhat nebulous what defines these two links, how they're connected. But one thing's for certain is that Lacan is against, I guess, pretty much all the linguists which were current at his time. He's against Saussure in that he's holding that the circuit of meaning is not the product of one signified's dependence on another signified, but rather there is an internal property of the signifier itself, and this is the signifier as structuring agent, the signifier as structure itself, which ultimately determines what goes on in language. Now, a little bit later on, he says, concerning the second form of aphasic disorders. I think this is important, this sentence here. Notice the strict coherence there is between maintaining the positional function of language and maintaining an adequate stock of terms. This is an absolutely incontestable clinical phenomenon and shows us the fundamental binding of the signifier. What appears at the grammatical level as characteristic of the positional link reappears at all levels and sets up the synchronic coexistence of terms. Now we're in the realm of synchronicity. The verbal locution is its highest form. It's like a sentence. At a lower level, there is the word, which has the air of a stability that, as you know, has been rightly challenged. While the independence of the word manifests itself from certain angles, it can't be regarded as radical. The word can in no way be regarded as a unit of language, even though it constitutes a privileged elementary form. At an even lower level, you find the phonematic oppositions or couplings, which characterize the ultimate radical element that distinguishes one language from another. All right, there's a lot going on in that one paragraph alone. I feel like it's a pivotal juncture in the lecture, and this is what I wrote, not so much to try to explain what he means, but at least explain the thoughts that he stimulated for me. So the positional in this case is the propositional, the syntactical. The ways signifiers are disposed in syntactical arrangements determine meaning in language. The synchronic coexistence of terms, as he puts it, is guaranteed by grammatical arrangements, which, or just arrangements in general, let's say, that repeat throughout the structure to varying degrees. Positionality defines what he calls contexture. Well, actually, that's what Jacobson calls that which the person with similarity disorder is striving for to create with his language, because the substitutions aren't available. So it's like his struggles with expressing himself are always related to sort of makeshift context almost at all points. Continuing, the quote unquote stock of terms belonging to a language is given its meaning within the contexture guaranteed by grammatical arrangements. The aphasic with similarity disorder is overly dependent on contexture, as he is unable to produce the equational predication which allows one term to be substituted by another from the lexical code. The convolutions of his paraphrases worm about the lacunae engendered by an inability to nominate the subject. The aphasic with contiguity disorder can produce metaphor, but his utterances amount to mere word heaps. The less a word depends grammatically on the context, this is Lacan, the less a word depends grammatically on the context, the stronger is its tenacity in the speech of aphasics with a contiguity disorder, and the sooner it is dropped by patients with a similarity disorder. He says that, and this is still Lacan, the kernel subject word, back to me, is the durable element of the contiguity disorder aphasics speech. So they have these kernel subject words, which of course the person with similarity disorder would so badly like to be able to produce. The morphemic and phonemic similarities between terms internal to a series of declensions or conjugations elude the contiguity disorder aphasic. In many cases, a root word will predominate in the speech of the aphasic, while the derivative forms of the root word will pose a difficulty to this same category of aphasic. This shows us how the battery bank of signifiers is ultimately maintained through the construction of propositional units within which are contained elements that are divisible into smaller phonematic units. And this is the entire sprawling structure of language. The most capacious form is the verbal locution, which is comprised of words which, as Lacan says, can in no way be regarded as a unit of language, even though it constitutes a privileged elementary form. So the word is form, but not unit, right? The only units he recognizes are these phonematic oppositions or couples, which make possible differentiation within language, but also between languages. As Jacobson succinctly puts it, all phonemes denote nothing but mere otherness. So it's a non-significative otherness that proves to be, in some sense, the indestructible substance of language, which paradoxically gives rise to meaning through the mediator of these oppositional couplings. That's what I was able to gather from this. Phonematic differentiality is one of the links of language internal to the signifier. The other link being the positional relation, which ensures the functioning of this substitution. Deprived of a contexture held fast by meta-language, that first type of aphasic cannot make substitutions on the basis of an unrestricted access to a language, which in Jacobson's words connects the symbols of a meta-language with the symbols of the language referred to. So a meta-language is what allows us to talk about language itself. That is a language which has provided an undergirding that allows for this substitution. That's what meta-language does. And this is the last passage I'll quote along with my commentary here. I really love this, what he says here. It's not for nothing that the word prolixity is the same word as proliferation. Prolixity is the frightening word. all use of language incurs fright, which stops people and finds expression in the fear of intellectuality. He intellectualizes too much, people say. This serves as an alibi for the fear of language. In fact, you can observe that there is verbalism. I had to look this up. Verbalism is when you use words just to use them, but never really get to the contents of what you're trying to say. You can observe that there is verbalism wherever one makes the error of granting too much weight to the signified, whereas it's by heading further in the direction of the independence of the signifier and the signified that all operations of logical construction adopt their full effect. And he's giving you a little clue as to his own technique when it comes to formalization, I think, in this passage. At least for the phenomena that interest us, one will always fall into verbalism by further adhering to what I call the mythology of significance. Mathematics, on the other hand, uses a language of pure signifier, a meta-language par excellence. It reduces language to its systematic function upon which another system is built, grasping the former in its articulation. The efficacy of this way of doing things isn't in doubt in its own register. So this isn't so much a direct commentary on that, but what he says a little bit before that passage, which I quoted about language reduplicating or reproducing itself within its own register, and why this concept of meta language is so important for understanding metaphor. And it's an illusory sort of outside to language. Language, its entire structure, is constantly reproduced almost in this sort of smaller capillary form within it. And that itself causes a kind of fright. There's something uncanny almost about language's capacity to mirror itself as a sort of species of its own genus. Mm-hmm. So metaphor grasps language as a whole. It reduplicates itself within its own register, and this allows for a structure of positional equivalency. Substitution is the agency of metaphor which blocks metonymic proliferation. I'm jumping a little bit ahead here to, I think, what we're going to further explore in later chapters, but the imaginary identification, or I should say identifications, and the intersubjective bond, which lies along the axis traversing the L schema from A apostrophe, lowercase a apostrophe, to A, this imaginary wall of language that we've been talking about, this metaphor of I am me, I am myself. It constitutes the breeding ground of metaphor. And this originary metaphor, that of the paternal function, secures the functionality of the shifter. You know, this is something that I don't think many Lacanians point out, but our favorite right now, Chiesa, does, and that's that the I is the name of the Father qua shifter. And this shifter I, in relation to what Paris and I in a recent conversation talked about, and I'm quoting him, is related to a particular metonymic chain as isolated. So in a sense, what we get in metaphor and in the originary paternal metaphor is a freezing of the subject in place alongside a specific metonymic succession, which itself is brought to a halt by the quilting point, and that between these two poles, the dimension of metaphor is animated. Metaphor, in that sense, is a misrecognition. It's a breakdown in language. You would think Lacan would describe it as something that makes things work for the neurotic, but in true Lacanian fashion, he describes anything you would think as a success as a breakdown, a malfunction. And metaphor is a malfunction because neurosis is no less a malfunction than psychosis in a sense. It's just one that allows you to be better socialized. But of course, it's still a breakdown. So metaphor is a kind of misrecognition, a breakdown in language, and it's a breakdown from which the identifications between the subject but qua ego, the subject thinking as its ego, and the signifying apparatus itself are obtained in this way. Now that's more like larger picture metaphor. You know, you have poetic metaphor. His sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful. Love is a pebble laughing in the sunshine. These are examples he uses to really condense the power of metaphor in its, you know, poetic valence. But I think those examples are misleading. They're highly misleading, and you want to focus on them, but I think too much focus steers us off course, because what he's getting at with his mention of the dead father in the chapter that you presented on, and what we're going to be reading very shortly with the quilting point, is that the metaphor, of course, has to do with the absence of the subject, what later is just going to be the cut of the subject. And I do think that despite the confusion, if we relate his sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful to the cut of the subject, it does emerge there. It does emerge as its absence in a very startling way, however misleading it is. And it's the same with familiar, what we talked to Paris about. What Paris says is that familiar, yes, it's metonymic, but it has the structure of metaphor. Well, why? Because there's a blockage. Because in a sense, it's an attempt. It is its own attempt to quilt itself. And I wouldn't have noticed this. I wouldn't have known this because I don't know German. And Max, you can further elaborate on this, but that, you know, the word mille for like thousand or mile, I think, I don't know if mile is one of the examples, but basically it blocks from within the clear interpretation of, oh yeah, family millionaire. Okay, easy enough to understand this condensation. We've got family, we've got familiar, we've got millionaire. We've just unpacked all of the options, but no, it blocks itself through this ulterior sort of metaphor that presents itself. Now, this reminds me of what Chiesa says in Subjectivity and Otherness. Along the horizontal axis, we get metonymy, right? The vertical axis is metaphor and metonymy in the unconscious. Metaphor is constantly blocking the free flow, let's say, of metonymy. And it's this blockage that in analysis is paid due almost. It's given a certain attention that within this dynamic described by the imaginary wall of language, it never would. In the sense that we can see how these sorts of metaphors, identifications between different signifiers in the unconscious arise almost organically. And I haven't quite fleshed this out, but I think it has something also to do with temporality in that sense. And then the diachronic and the synchronic. But I fear if I riff any longer, I'll start sounding a little like an aphasic myself. So That was a lot. Hopefully there's some jumping off points there.
Oh, that was lovely. That was lovely. That was very inspiring. Like finally, I get what the two links are he was talking about because he announces, I'm gonna now talk about the two links, and then he mentions one of them, and then goes on to make like a whole description of language is made up of words, but words aren't actually a linguistic unit, but phonemes are, and the breakdown was really good, and now I get it. And but I don't know, I really want to talk about familiar because we talked about it before. And yeah, I my understanding now is like the way I understood what Paris is saying now after I read all these chapters and Jakobson and so on is it's I don't really get why it cannot be a metaphor. Right? He was saying it's not a metaphor in the classical sense. The only way I can understand that is it's not a metaphor in the classical sense because it's a neologism. And the metaphor that we are looking at is not about neologisms. It's just about a signifier being put at a place where it's not supposed to be, right? That's kind of what Lacan is saying here. So it's a neologism.
Yeah, or a portmanteau, but it acts as a
Yeah,
neologism. I mean, that's exactly, you could use the same thing for Leclerc's case with poor jelly,
yeah.
classical example. And it's because it's like it doesn't function on the level of discourse like any other sort of discourse would, but it still has that. I think the crucial thing that you pointed out in your presentation, which is what Lacan points out, is identification and the way it sort of identifies with the subject, to kind of put it bluntly.
I mean, it really identifies with the subject, you could say also, because it is, as you described and analyzed, Nick, that it brings things together that don't belong together and kind of strings together an antagonism, right? That cannot be resolved, as you were saying, like it's neither family, it's not millionaire, and you can't really cut it apart nicely. So it's almost like a math theme, right? It's like
Yeah.
antagonism
Mhm.
in one place.
And a
I guess that's
symptom.
why Paris said it's a letter, right?
And a symptom. Like it's absolutely symptomal
Yeah.
in that sense too.
Yeah.
Because and anyone who's undergone analysis, it's like you'll never know which nut your analyst tries to crack at any moment in this flow of signifiers and what it could possibly lead to
Mhm.
in terms of these associations. And all those associations are metonymic, but it's that kind of like the cut or the gesture that Chiesa and
Mhm.
Paris introduced to us that is also characteristic of analysis, where that cut is going to occur. um it's very unpredictable, and
Yeah,
then things are predictable. Yeah.
and this is what is so important, to put it simply, like in the analysis perspective, like in the clinical sense, that jab at Jungianism is so important, because with that and any other discourse, but part of the Jungian aspect is the fetishism of symbols. And so you give them objective meaning, even if they're like symbols could have multiple representations over time. There's no argument of which one is which, that they're all meaningful. And so when the subject of the unconscious is relaying stuff to the other, that aspect is foreclosed. That truth procedure is foreclosed over the saturation of this imaginary meaning with the analyst and the analyst. And so we maintain this sort of imaginary other and the ego, versus what happens on this level is where we get your example of familiar, why it's neither family nor millionaire. It's like this sort of cut which becomes mathemic, because, well, when we look at the schema L, the imaginary wall of language is broken. We see that the big other of the unconscious is being addressed by the subject of the unconscious on this signifier or this letter, whatever it is. The point is that this is being formally addressed. And so the point of the analyst is to, in those moments, be like, what do you mean by that? because the analyst is the sort of empty other, or positions themselves in this empty position of the big other, to be able to relay the message in an inverted form to the subject, to be able to unpack that, because none of them know the meaning, but it ruptures continuity and meaning in this punctual moment in the transference.
Yeah, as you were
How we
saying,
see the subject divide itself into that.
Yeah, and it's making me think also, just when you feed the analysand feed back what they threw in your direction as analysts, as a signifier in its material form, then they're confronted with the materiality of that, and materiality of the signifier in that way is going to set them off on another set of rails. Set that go like when Freud describes like a switch word, and it might have not, it has nothing to do with the signified necessarily of that signifier as you would find in an S2 in a dictionary, but rather what kind of like phonemes might be contained in that signifier, and what will it as like a living organism latch itself to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's because like, and I have to specify, I'm talking about like meaning specifically versus signification, because the point is that these punctual moments do end up uh building up or quilting towards signification and the enunciation of the I. But it's totally different than meaning making, which is on the side of psychotherapeutics, uh,
Mm.
ego psychology, even maybe, and Jungians, because everything is meaningful and it's objectified. And so it could already be pre established onto the unconscious as this sort of like tabernacle full of cauldron, or this instincts, or libidinal things that need to be synthesized into meaning for the ego or for individuation, or to rehabilitate the patient, you name it. There is already the sort of pre-established meaning that is intersubjective, or it acts like how we're talking everyday discourse. We know that there's meaning, right? But in analysis, that sort of one-to-one ratio is
Mm.
split, because we don't know what the other wants, this other of language, that has these treasure troves of signifiers that relate to other signifiers for their meaning, right?
yeah, that Jungianism is really actually a complete regression to like ancient dream interpretation, right? Exactly like ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian dream interpretation, where you have these books where like, okay, you dream of two crows, that means this, right?
Yeah,
That's
it
almost like exactly how archetypes.
yeah, it's definitely like like he does treat it like a form of divination, and he does relay it to divination a handful of times in his metapsychological theory, or his like pseudo anthropology research. But it's for Freud, it's like always about the dream that's forgotten, or never about like the manifest content, but the latent content, and this like dialectic between the two, even the day residues, and how like, yeah, some dreams we can remember, and this is because we have to understand his model of pre-conscious, conscious, and the unconscious, and how like we could see the ego operate on all three topographies. But the thing is that the ego is only important as if it's a formation of defense against the unconscious, not that there's anything to synthesize in it, or
Yeah.
libidinal things that are regressed towards a similar stage, like, or to like a a primitive stage that we need to make meaningful and integrate into the ego, right? That's the sort of Freudian revisionism of, it's like, oh yeah, you're like this because there's something of the oral or anal stage that wasn't worked through, so we must learn to like create meaning and sublimate it into your ego.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not what Freud or Lacan are doing,
Yeah,
right?
at the base level is not whatever meaning or whatever, right? It's a kind of rupture. That's what it is at the base level. And I think like I still want to go back to Familiar, right? Because I was thinking about while you were talking, like, why does it have the structure of metaphor? And what did Paris say? It has the structure of metaphor. I guess I would relate it to what you were saying, Nick, about metaphor forming a kind of pseudo meta language that kind of makes language into this synchronic whole, right? So it is a linguistic unit that actually belongs to this whole of language, but we take it out and make it different from it through, at least the examples suggest that, putting it at a place where it doesn't belong, right? So it's a difference of something that is actually the same. It's the same with language, but we make a difference of it by putting it at the wrong place. It's kind of similar with familionaire because it's one word, but yet it is different from itself. And so metaphor would be kind of the forming of a Möbius strip from language, where you have the one language that returns to itself in inverted form and forming this twisted strip, right? And you have like family, millionaire, things that are completely don't belong together, yet they are put together. So you have difference and similarity, bam, you have metaphor. I guess that's why it's structured.
Yeah, and the meta language isn't necessarily the language used to describe tropes belonging to different sorts of like literary styles. Although it's used that way, I think for Lacan, you're never at the level of meta language, right? There is no meta language, but it is this sudden manifest sort of invisibility which cuts through. And that is what makes Familionaire so exciting and funny and frightful for us, in that it's this moment of language reduplicating itself within itself via the cut. And it's in those examples, it's in the sudden neologisms, one that's not even intended, right? That was one that was produced as a condensation in the moment, that we experience the cut, I think, most viscerally.
Right.
That's the dimension of the letter, and that's
Yeah.
the dimension of the unconscious as
Yeah.
letter, and that's
But
what's difficult to grasp.
yes,
but just what
and how it produces the subject, and you mentioned, I think it was you, Max, about how Lacan will reference a lot of contributions to the linguistics and to the linguists
yeah.
he references, but then he'll harshly critique them.
Oh, that
I
was
think
Nick.
there's a general critique of all of the French linguists that he picks from, is that they don't account for the subject. And this is
Yeah.
if we talk about the metalinguistic aspect of what these topologies are, even though we're never at the level of metalanguage, but we see them cut through, it's the elementary structure of what his discourse is, or the analyst discourse is that it is not just of the signifier, but the subject, right? And it's the subject that manifests itself in this cut through familiar, in my opinion, or through the signifier that comes up temporally, the letter of the unconscious, which the unconscious has this temporal element in Seminar 11 in relation to objet A, but the letter as well. The unconscious is letter, as you said, Nick. And so this is how we see this rupture and this cut, and as he'll say in Seminar 16, fold within itself to create this Mobius strip of the subject using the signifier to refer to the other, only to come back to itself in an inverted form, right? We're seeing how this topology plays through. And of course, this production of it has, jouissance. But the point is that we see that through this movement, it keeps coming back to refer to itself. And it's like this impossibility.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm
And
thinking
like,
of the example of the man of the countryside in For They Know Not What They Do as a like imaginary story kind of way to talk about it, right? That you take something outside of language that actually belongs into it, and then language returns to itself from the outside as differentiated, and that's the forming of the Möbius strip, and that's metaphor. But really quickly before you continue, Nick, I just wanted to say it in a simpler way, what I try to express, it's okay, just to tie back to the examples that Lacan is giving here, and then familiar. Okay, you have the sentence, he treated me very familiar, right? Familiarly, I guess. I don't know.
Oh,
And at that place, a metaphor would be, at that place would be, he treated me very millionaire. Doesn't belong there at that place. But it's put at the place of familiarly, right? And so it's exactly the same logic that he's talking about here with these examples of lavish.
oh, so he says he treated me very familiar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
I gotta check, but it's like a whole sentence, and it's something like he treated me very familiar, yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's a deformity of this process or deformation where it's like think about the shifter and think about what Branner told us. The shifter, of course, isn't the subject, but it stands for the subject in the subject of the statement. It's not the subject of the enunciation, but we have this shifter which, depending on how the sentence ends, is going to change. In the case of watch out for your team, okay, team ends up being the subject of the sentence, but it comes later. I am a hungry man was the other one Branner used. So if I'm a satiated man, the I changes completely. We have a different descriptor attached to it. If I'm a hungry man, the opposite. I am however many men in any one day. Maybe not a man at all. Only time will tell. But basically, we have the quilting point of the statement, which kind of holds the shifter in place because the shifter itself, it's frenzied, right? And if you look at what Schreber is undergoing, his hallucinations, the way they shift, he is the conduit for different beings. He is different beings at different points, and he's like anatomized in various symbolic ways. But it's like this shifter is constantly shifting. It needs to be held in place. And it is the quilting point that does that via metaphor, but it is an arresting that always fails, right? In some sense, it always fails because it does produce an excess. It does lead to the return of the repressed, and it's very it's tenuous, right? And that's why it's difficult. That guy Saboni, the French analyst, yeah, he says some confusing things, but I do like how he said in his lecture about this that it's very difficult for many people to make symbolic statements about themselves, your symbolic role in society. And we can decide later if this is metaphor metonymy exactly, but if you say, I am a teacher, I am an engineer, it's very difficult for many people to say that with any strong conviction because it's a metaphor about yourself that depends on repression and your relationship to an S2 and the entire signifying apparatus and how you locate yourself within it. I don't know if any of that made sense. I'm kind of all over the place, but much like the shifter.
Much like that analyst you were talking
Yeah.
about. He's
Much
so
like
confusing.
Siboni. I kind of like him. I kind of like
You're a hungry man.
I also like him. I also like him, but he's very confusing. He's like mimicking Lacan kind of.
Yeah, I think
He's just
so.
continuing it. But yeah, I think metaphor is the return of the repressed, you know?
Mhm.
And for neurotics, they make a metaphor, but the metaphor is the return of the repressed. But for Schreber, he isn't aphasic. but God is like the rays are, they have aphasia basically. It's impossible that the repressed can't return in the symbolic because there is no metaphor which would be the return of the repressed. It has to return in the real.
You also need the subject to be able to count and account for itself. That's where the return would come. Because to count or to even relay the signifier to the other, the subject needs the signifier to represent itself to the other. The other also maintaining that battery bank of signifiers, or the treasure trove of signifiers, S2, then relaying it back to the primary point of return. And that's where this sort of rupture makes itself known, especially if the analyst positions themselves in that placeholder of the other, or the little part from the other that would be objet a. And it's interesting in this like early, he doesn't say it in this one, but I know in like seminar 4, 5, and 6, the metonymic object is objet a. Doesn't Chiesa also say that, Nick, in subjectivity and otherness?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
for
it's
sure.
always the remainder of the other.
Because it's the imaginary phallus. It becomes the imaginary phallus, which itself signifies an unknown X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
because the imaginary phallus is the loss. It is the mirror stage image of mastery, right?
because it's like in the dialectic of frustration, and you could miss this, but it's very important. And Lacan's describing it right now with Anna Freud and all of the different treats, right? That are metonymically unpacked under the heading of her name, where it's like there's an identification with objects of desire as a way of responding to the desire of the mother, which is like an all engulfing desire. So you identify with an enumeration of
No,
different
but I think he's
desirable
saying there
objects.
the identification isn't working yet,
No, it doesn't. It doesn't work necessarily. No, but
but the
Chiesa
endeavor
says
is there.
there is there isn't identification in the sense of an identification with an ego, but there is something like an ideal ego, which isn't which. Okay, this is I'm not so clear on, but obviously the ideal ego comes about through identification with the mirror image.
Yes, yes. So that is
The
the
imago.
instantiation of the ideal ego.
But
And it's
then there's another stage, right, where it's like you also conversely identify with the objects of the mother's desire,
Mhm.
and then they become, when you say like introjected,
They become
part of your body.
introjected. Yeah, and on the level of the way it's placed in graph 2 of the graph of desire. Again, I don't like to use the term the graph of desire, but everybody knows it as that because I only say this because they were never called the graphs of desire. And we're
Right.
polemics of desire, right? Reducing Lacan to, but what I'm getting at is that then we see how in this process of identification, we get into the other side as the subject chain and the chain of the signifier meet, that then we get on this field of ego, ideal ego with the other as mother, and then the ego ideal.
Yeah,
But there has
right.
to be a signifier that introduces that for that to happen.
That's what I'm saying. There is actually
Yeah.
an ontogenetic stage where there is no ego ideal yet because the
Yeah.
paternal metaphor hasn't taken
Yeah.
hold, and there is an attempt to be the imaginary phallus for the mother by identifying with
Yeah.
the metonymic object, which is just metonymy itself as an answer to the mother's
Yeah.
desire, but this is
Yeah.
pre-intervention of the
Right.
father
Yeah, yeah.
signification of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And then we would see, and we because we have to account for its emergence, but on those graphs, even we're always already in even graph 4, even if we're just looking at the smallest point of the graph. And it's like we wouldn't get ego ideal without the paternal metaphor, the introduction of the Oedipus. And we could account for an emergence at a point where there was a pre-Oedipal, but only after the fact, right?
Right. Because it's like, so then the what was once the metonymic object of the mother's desire which is a pre-significant, let's say, reappears in the formula of fantasy, as that which the other lacks, and what the other looks to the subject to complete it.
Mhm.
Or,
Yes.
but
Yes.
from the inverse of the subject is object A for the big other, right? Um, and what I wanted to say, and I think I just lost it, is no, metonymically vanished.
Mhm.
Oh, but you were already going into the direction that because you mentioned Anna Freud, and I was saying there is no identification yet. There's not that identification of the symbolic of the subject that would stop that metonymy.
Right, because
Hold that. Yeah.
remember what Zizek points out in For They Know Not What They Do. I was very confused the first time I read this, but it makes a lot more sense, is that the quilting point is what gives birth to the ego ideal. And there is no ego ideal without a quilting point, hence the paternal metaphor. So there's neither the shifter of the eye nor the period at the end of the sentence without this ego ideal that's secured for you by also the symbolic phallus. It just means that there's something to desire pretty much outside of the self that you are for your mother. Hence the phallus being the rolling pin that stopped the crocodile's jaws from clamping shut,
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is something that is not underlined by most Lacanians, I think, which is that how object A emerges from this metonymic object and
Yeah.
what it has to do with the desire of the mother and this whole process of signification
Mhm.
ultimately. Because what makes the metonymic object in this case so tormenting is the fact that it cannot be the child lacks the means to signify it
Yeah.
in a way that would allow the child to do do away with being this pleasure ego that Freud describes, which sounds great. It's like everything I hate, I spit out, reject. Everything I love, I take in. But that's a maddening process. That is like, in a sense, psychosis. And
Mhm.
Lorenzo goes as far as to say, the child is pretty much psychotic.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what he talks about too in like the one of the essays on neurosis and psychosis, is that there is something like almost like a psychotic state, but that it's through this substitute of reality that we could get neurosis. And I think for Lacanian language, it's like um it is this process of metaphor and metonymy, which structures the umwelt, right? Or the establishment of the signifier that could create a division between interiority and exteriority of Innenwelt and Umwelt, right?
Right, which is like it's a gain for sure, but
Yeah.
it's a dubious gain insofar as like the barrier that's set up there is not really a barrier at all. It's very permeable. It's a very permeable kind of barrier that the signifier is both the breach and the suture here. It's both what seems to cut one off from objects of desire and what is supposedly the means of securing this object of desire, which is constantly changing anyway. It's like the metonymic process never ends, but thanks to metaphor, we can at least temporarily kind of, you know, uh, guard our position through life and maintain a tenuous sort of meta stability. But
Yeah.
it could break down, you know. Um,
It could break down, but the blueprint is there. I think that's
Yeah.
the point that's also often made by Lacan, that initial symbolic identification happened. And so you always have the capacity to do it. But for Schreber, it's the capacity is just not there to have a metaphor in that sense. But I just wanted to clarify that actually the sentence is, I'm freely translating from the German now. I sat next to Solomon Rothschild, and he treated me just like himself and his, or just like his people, very familiar. That's
Mm.
that. He treated
Well,
me
is familiarly as awkward of a word in German as it is in English? Because I feel like familiarly.
familiar. The word would be familiar. No, not that awkward.
Okay.
It would function at that place, but millionaire would be completely at the wrong place.
Yeah.
I'm
So I think it has the structure of metaphor because it showcases how millionaire is at the place of familiarly. Right?
as someone who's prone to slips, I feel
Yeah.
like I would trying to say familiarly would definitely invite some weird
No, but familiar
attitude.
is casual in
It's
German.
casual, okay.
But the thing is, the interesting thing is that it's basically the whole word millionaire is there. Just the F and A is added at the beginning, right? So it's almost like millionaire is at the place of familiarly.
Yeah. And then where's the other one that you get after Fat Millionaire, which is the other one that Lacan will talk about. And
I don't know.
yeah, it's in Seminar 5. He goes, it's the first chapter is like Familionaire, the other one's Fat Millionaire.
But it's just like, it's just like the example of this surrealist play in
Yeah.
something. Or like a Boaz and the sheaf. And like the sheaf is at the place of Boaz, just like millionaires at the place of familiarly. And in the same way, there is this undoing of lexical connections, right?
Mm.
The only difference is the familiarly is still there. The trace of it is still there. So that's why it's not a metaphor, but it has the structure of it. That's what I think.
Mm. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's
Well, all I know is I am a hungry man. When I am hungry, I eat S2.
I eat S2.
Yeah.